Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Alton and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions, and other historical programs and tours, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Tonight's lecture, a program made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features Dr. Matthew Keagle discussing the other 1776, reform and French military dress in the Ancien Regime. Following its catastrophic defeat in the 7 Years' War, the French military undertook a comprehensive series of reforms affecting everything from warship design to soldiers' uniforms, which dramatically altered the Army's appearance. This uniform provided unheard-of amenities for French soldiers, but was widely disliked and quickly replaced. The fallout surrounding the 1776 uniform reflects the most consequential moment of the 18th century for the material culture of the French military. Far from being an emblem of staid or conservative past, military dress in France in the last decades of the Ancien Regime was a dynamic representation of the stakes of reform and the character of the nation. Tonight, Dr. Keagle will discuss the 1776 reforms on French military dress during the Revolutionary War and their subsequent reactions. Matthew Keagle is the curator of the Fort Ticonderoga Museum in Ticonderoga, New York. Dr. Keagle has been involved in curation, exhibitions, research, historical interpretation, and program development for historic sites and museums in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Delaware, Virginia, North and South Carolina. He holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, a master's in American Material Culture from the Winterthur Museum, and earned his PhD from the Bard Graduate Center in New York. Dr. Keagle joined Fort Ticonderoga's leadership team in May of 2014, serving as Director of Exhibitions, and was named Fort Ticonderoga's interim curator in December of 2014 before Curator of Collections shortly after. As Fort Ticonderoga's Curator of Collections, Dr. Keagle utilizes his training, scholarship, expertise, and experience to present, augment, and preserve Fort Ticonderoga's extensive library, archival, and artifact collections, along with overseeing Fort Ticonderoga's broader cultural resources. Now, before I turn things over to Dr. Keagle, there are a few housekeeping items for those of you tuning in with us on Zoom this evening. Following this evening's lecture, there will be a question and answer session. So please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Keagle using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions, those can be also submitted using the Q&A chat or to the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Keagle.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you who have braved the weather here in Washington, D.C., or the airwaves, as they are, online to be here tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here at Anderson House and to be at the home of the Society of the Cincinnati with their incredible collections and history here. I'm going to be delving into a topic that in some ways is only peripheral to the American Revolution, which is why I've entitled this talk, The Other 1776. And it's my hope that during tonight's discussion, I'll kind of be able to impress maybe three salient things upon the audience. One of them is simply contextualizing the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution more broadly, with events and occurrences that were going on well outside of the kind of traditional American narrative of that conflict, because there are events of great consequence occurring elsewhere in the world. Beyond that, I would like, frankly, to advocate for material culture, for the study of things, of objects, beyond simply their use as pure illustration, as a lot of historians, I think, still today do, throw in a coat or a portrait or a musket simply as an illustration of a thing rather than as something that drives their historical narrative. And I'm going to hopefully at least ground this in things and real things and their impact in the world. And finally, I hope in doing so to show the vibrancy of the last decades of the Ancien Regime in Europe, or maybe to put it a little bit differently, a period from the kind of early 1760s until the very late 1780s at its narrowest. Probably expands a little beyond that, to be completely honest. But this is a period that kind of predates and overlaps with a scholarly period that's often called the Age of Revolution, which is often dated at the beginning of the American War of Independence in 1775. I guess in a very technical sense, that's not the beginning of the War of Independence. Nevertheless, this is a period that I am going to be discussing that kind of pushes into that overlaps that period, and constitutes maybe even a distinct age of reform in which an enormous amount about the old world of European states was destroyed or changed and altered, leading up to the broader revolutions for which this period is often given its name, namely the French Revolution, Haitian Revolution as well. And I'm going to focus on France, the Kingdom of France, in no small part because I think that these changes occurred most dramatically in France, as we will see, which is probably a good place for me to get started. I'm going to be talking about French military dress over the course of the 18th century, and we have to remember that France entered the 18th century as the arbiter of military fashion in Europe. You can see it, maybe not to its greatest extent, in Watteau's images from the very early part of the 18th century. They're looking a little rough around the edges, but France is a major power. France, in many ways, is the nation that we owe military uniforms as we understand them today for. Of course, the English will dispute this, claiming that the new model army of the British Civil Wars introduced full military uniforms. There's some debate about whether they were really able to accomplish that in practice. Nevertheless, the French are able to do it under the kind of centralization and authoritarian regime of Louis XIV, consolidating a great deal of power at the royal level. And uniforms are one of the very visible markers of this regime as it unfolds over the late 17th and the early 18th century. And in fact, I think uniforms themselves are a really kind of interesting, if not ideal, marker of this period. This is, of course, what especially European historians call the early modern era, where we see the beginning of the structures of a familiar modern world, yet side by side with these extensions of, in some cases, almost a feudal, medieval and Renaissance past. It is early modern because it's not yet fully modern. So we see the creation of nation states, and yet we see the persistence of old privileges and ideas and concepts kind of filtering throughout this. And uniforms, I think, are an incredible expression of this because they are an artifact of this time period. They don't exist in this way before that, yet we still have them today. Of course, the uniforms of the 18th century look very different from that of today for a host of reasons. And uniforms also, though, express these fault lines of the early modern era in that, they represent in a very real way the power of these coalescing nation states. And yet at the same time, they owe their origins to kind of almost feudal structures of ownership. And so this makes them, I think, particularly useful objects to study in this time period. And France is the leader of this. Now, I should say, though, over the course of the first half of the 18th century, France's leadership maybe not wanes so much as stagnates, as, of course, many powers do. If you lead the pack in some field, they become a little complacent, and you can ride on the success of past creations. And I think this is what happens to a certain extent in France. If we look at the surviving imagery, and of course, artifacts from the first half of the 18th century are incredibly rare, even those from later in the 18th century are rather rare, but from the early part, much rarer. So we rely to a certain extent on visual representations and descriptions. And we can see, as you do here, that the change over even a 30-year period here is marginal as the French kind of retrench into a style that, frankly, they popularize and they continue to wear. And in fact, some of the very specific elements of French military dress, even well into the middle of the 18th century, owe their origins to the 17th century precedents for all of these uniforms. So for instance, if you were not aware, French military uniforms by the middle of the 18th century had no means, kind of numerically or otherwise through insignia, to differentiate between different regiments of the army. The way you tell different regiments is through an almost arcane combination of the cuffs of the uniform and the color of those cuffs, sometimes the collar as well, the color of the button that the soldier wears, either a white metal or yellow metal button, the distinct shape of the pocket flap or pocket flaps, and the application of buttons and buttonholes onto that. And this is actually an artifact that dates back to fashionable styles from the end of the 17th century. This image here is from the Army Museum in Stockholm in Sweden, which probably preserves the oldest true uniforms in the sense that we understand them today from the end of the 17th century, reportedly made in France, actually. And they show some of the distinctive characteristics of late 17th century uniforms, including the kind of odd combination of buttons and pocket flaps that were, as we can see in fashion prints from this time period, popular at the end of the 17th century. So in a very real way, the French army, even well into the 18th century, is holding over some of these elements of much older bits of fashion. Now, I don't want to go too much further here, I'll hold back here, by kind of emphasizing how retardataire the French army was, because I think it's easy for the general population, the general public, as well as many historians, to kind of overplay the stagnation of military styles, which is often seen as being a conservative, kind of staid object of material culture. And the entire intent of this talk is to show how that is not the case. However, even in moments where change is minimal, I think it's important to acknowledge when change does occur and what that means. And even if change does not itself occur over these periods of time, it doesn't mean that people aren't thinking about it, talking about it, writing about it. Those things just may never come to fruition. And so throughout the first half of the 18th century, there are people that criticize the military dress of France and of other nations for various defects. I think the loudest, if not actually in life, but in the ongoing significance of military dress in the 18th century, was Maurice Comte de Saxe, the great French marshal that sees the Ancien Regime to its greatest victories of the 18th century. And to be completely honest, most of what the world knows about his impressions of military dress were actually published after his death, posthumously, as his Rêveries or Memoir on the Art of War, originally published first, I believe, in 1757 in the Low Countries, Netherlands, subsequently, and very rapidly reprinted as translation, both in London and in Edinburgh, with a wide distribution, frankly, across the Atlantic world. And famously, at least for those of us who are interested in this kind of thing, Henry Knox responds to a query from John Adams in 1776. He had been asked by Knox for some reading recommendations in 1775, was delayed in no small part by hauling 60 tons of artillery from Ticonderoga to just outside of Boston. But when he finally got back in touch with him, he suggests a number of titles that Adams should read for Americans who are learning to become soldiers. And foremost amongst them, he places Saxe. In fact, he says, quote, he stalks a god in war. That is the extent of Saxe's impact, or at least the impact of his theories across the Atlantic world. And Saxe is one who had deeply critical things to say about the French army's dress by the middle of the 18th century. Very different, I think, from the impression that most historians in the public have about how contemporaries thought about military clothing in the 18th century. He says, in fact, that he bemoans that military dress is dominated by, quote, the love of appearance over, quote, the regard to health. And he goes on in some great detail to explain the problems with the French army's clothing at mid-century. The big full-skirted, heavy-cuffed coats of the era, he felt, used too much material. There is this nasty habit of them absorbing moisture, and the retention of moisture close to the body is something that's often identified as being the source of soldiers' maladies. It comes in for a great deal of criticism over the 18th century, and Saxe is one of the kind of foremost authors discussing this. He proposes, in his posthumous memoirs, a number of alterations to the dress of the French army, which, as you might be able to tell by this plate that's in one of the editions, never actually came to fruition. He emphasized a totally new way of dressing based on lighter weight clothing, but many layers thereof. And all of it was designed to increase the soldiers' ability to move, to decrease restriction on various parts of the soldiers' bodies, which he felt was being constricted by various buckles and straps and kind of things over his legs and arms, and also to prevent moisture from getting near the soldier and keeping him healthy, because being healthy was an important means of fighting, and fighting, of course, was a means of asserting France's dominance militarily. In fact, he even describes at one point that he felt that the soldier's hair as well, of course, which is neatly drawn up and queued and powdered on formal occasions at least, would in the field turn into, quote, a filthy ornament, and suggests cutting the men's hair short and having them wear a Spanish sheepskin wig. And again, as you can laugh at in the audience, this is something that never actually went into fruition, but it shows the extent to which contemporaries were willing to even consider theoretical concepts for dramatically changing the dress of the army, much less more marginal changes. Now, when France goes into the 7 Years' War, it is in some ways largely still wearing clothing rather like that it entered the 18th century with. And you can see in this kind of caricature of the nations at war during the 7 Years' War, right of center is our Frenchman. He is wearing the very full-skirted, deep-cuffed coat that is kind of typically French in style, that the French had introduced in the late 17th century, and that they still, in some fashion, continue to wear well into the 18th century. And he's shown here with an array of other nations, various levels of bizarreness. And in the center is the Prussian grenadier. Prussia's rise to prominence and their prowess on the battlefield made them in many ways the new arbiters of military fashion, especially because they had a very different custom and style, one that was kind of a departure from the French-dominated styles of the first half of the 18th century, much tighter, shorter garments altogether, kind of a peculiarity of this central German kingdom, but one that had an incredible impact on the next few decades of the developing institutions of the military and its material culture across Europe and frankly beyond. Now, it shouldn't be a spoiler for anyone here to tell you that France does not win the 7 Years' War. In fact, they lose the conflict quite spectacularly, and it is a loss, not just within Europe on the battlefields of Germany, but across the world, that is a real kind of blow to the psyche of France. And it causes an immense amount of introspection on the part of French administrators and officials and military men about how to redeem the nation, how to recover France's glory. And it is a movement for reform that sweeps into almost every facet of the French military, from grand tactics to the design of warships, quite literally down to the buttons of soldiers' uniforms. And it gets us into a period, again, from about 1763 through the 1780s, that is amongst the most vibrant in the alterations to the material culture of soldiers of the entire 18th century. And it's one that I think, because it looms in the shadow of the French Revolution, is often not given the credit that it deserves. And the reforms that were going on actually start even before the war is entirely over. The French promulgate an ordinance, or regulation, about clothing in 1762, the kind of penultimate year of the 7 Years' War. And that's the beginning, the first kind of movement of these 2 decades of restructuring the French army, a period that historian Christy Picicaro has characterized as, quote, a watershed moment in military thought during the Enlightenment. Now, these images may not look terribly different to you, but they actually show an enormous amount of change going on in the kind of slimming up of the lines of soldiers' dress. Again, following that Prussian style, or at least a broader style to kind of lighten the lines of clothing. The printed texts of regulations, though, at this time are already changing. They are diminishing a lot of the proprietary license of high-ranking officers and increasingly minutely regulating soldiers' dress. So, for instance, the Royal Ordinance of 1762 introduced for the first time specific dimensions for the lapels and collars of soldiers' cloaks, and for the first time introduced marked numerical military buttons on soldiers' uniforms. Marked buttons bearing regimental insignia or even national emblems, I think are so kind of obvious today that they go without notice, and yet they are an artifact of this period of reform in the 1760s. And that, of course, would inspire a lot more on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean and beyond. By 1767, at the end of the decade, there is yet another new règlement, a regulation detailing the dress of the French army. It dedicated 5 pages to the specific dimensions of the garments that were being produced for soldiers, as well as including an accompanying document which outlined even how much fabric to use in each one of these garments. There was yet another regulation issued in 1775, which even included a set of instructions to the master tailors of each regiment, indicating not only the amount of cloth that you would need, but actually how the patterns were to be laid out on that cloth for the greatest economy. And this I find fascinating because it tracks with other analyses of this time period and of the military reformers in France, like Ken Adler's work on the ordinance system and the new structures of discipline that were being implemented with new patterns of artillery and small arms. And this just goes to show how these material objects had big impacts within this world. And the need for such specific detail that was going on in all of these regulations is because of a fairly dramatic change to the actual uniforms that were being made. As you can see here, this is a very different style of dress from that of the 7 Years' War. Gone are those enormous kind of skirts and cuffs. Rather, you have a much sleeker, kind of taller looking uniform. Granted, the skirts are still a little long, as the French rather like, but the overall silhouette is a world away from that of the 1750s. And it shows those kind of slimmer lines from the Prussian influence that, even if not in an explicit way, is entering into military thought across the continent. Now, you may all be saying to yourselves, and you're justifiably right for doing so, well, Matt, what does it matter that the king is now specifying the width of the lapels on the uniform? Ultimately, what does this have to do with anything going on in a broader sense in the 18th century? And like I said, I think this follows other ways in which technocrats in the French state were trying to impose disciplines on areas outside of the military. By imposing on the prerogatives of tailors in making clothing, you are actually pushing into their realm outside of purely military details. And furthermore, because contemporaries at the time were talking about the importance of things like this. In fact, Marshal Saxe himself, in his Reverie, notes that, quote, matters of the utmost importance depend sometimes on trifles which escape our notice. So the great thinkers of the time suggest how much even minute details have an impact on these broader systems. And in 1776, which I'll get into in just a moment, we see yet another series of reforms that take the French army in a very new direction, really getting it to the pinnacle of its reform in the 18th century. And here we enter, if not our hero, depending on how you perceive this all, then at least the protagonist of the other 1776, Claude Louis Lecomte de Saint-Germain. He was a French nobleman who arose to the position of war minister as the American Revolution is unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic, and implements easily the most dramatic of the many reforms that cross over the French state in this time period. And I'll step back a moment to just stress here again how much France's defeat in the 7 Years' War was more than just military. It was a psychological blow. It was a moral blow to France. And it was a loss of confidence. And it prompted, again, these wide set of reforms. And Saint-Germain's stint as war minister in the middle of the 1770s represents the pinnacle, the apogee of these reforms. He had been born in 1707 in the province of Bresse in eastern France. And from a class of noblemen that was not of sufficient value or merit to rise high in the army, maybe outside of the French militia. And so he went outside of France itself to serve. And in that sense, he becomes, if not representative of, then I think emblematic, again, of these contradictions of the early modern period, where you see the creation of national armies in a somewhat recognizable form, and yet there is still a permeability to these armies that allows certain individuals to move through them, just like the Comte de Saint-Germain, who over the course of his early career ends up serving in the armies of the Elector of the Palatinate, the Austrian forces, as well as the Kingdom of Bavaria's armies. He's actually also courted to high command at various points in time by the Dutch Republic, the Prussians, as well as the Republic of Venice, all before ultimately coming back to serve his native France during the War of the Austrian Succession, where he serves directly under Marshal Saxe. And I think clearly imbibed some of Saxe's thoughts on reform measures within the French military. At the opening of the Seven Years' War, Saint-Germain was posted to the Channel coast, but shortly thereafter, he gets transferred to kind of the seat of war in Germany and fights with French forces there, to some credit, until 1760, when a dispute with one of his superiors, Marshal Broglie, actually causes him to quit the service. And to go into the disputes between the French officer corps of the 7 Years' War is an entire lecture into itself. But nevertheless, he leaves the army in 1760, but he's not in kind of retirement for long, because in 1761, he is hired by the King of Denmark, who is at the time receptive to reform measures and is fearful of a Russian invasion as the 7 Years' War is expanding, and is hired on as the Danish war minister and commander-in-chief. And while there, implements a series of somewhat profound reforms and structural changes to the Danish military. And one of the central pieces of these reforms is the change of the Danish army's uniform. He actually changes it twice. First, away from the red uniform that was the distinctive color of the Danish state. Don't ever let the English tell you that they have a lock on red. The Danes will fight back and tell you that red is their color, except for a brief period in the early 1760s when it was changed by Saint-Germain, first to blue and then later to white. Now, as you might imagine, this is a rather small detail in the grand scheme of things, but it added to a number of other issues that many Danes and many noblemen found as being deeply problematic. And as much as Saint-Germain's reforms in Denmark actually did address issues within the Danish military, for instance, he tried to effectively kind of nationalize much of the army rather than relying on hiring foreign troops to serve in the Danish military, which is something that I think many people would have advocated at the time. Yet, because this was being imposed by a foreigner, it was met with a great bit of apprehension, and ultimately he leaves the Danish service within the decade. And frankly, most of his reforms, like these uniform ones, are promptly reversed if they were ever actually enacted in the field at all. And so it's from this kind of semi-retirement in the later 1760s and early 1770s that Saint-Germain becomes a kind of a dark horse candidate when he's selected by Louis XVI as his Minister of War and installed on October 25th of 1775. And his tenure as Minister of War in France is marked by aggressive reforms across the board, beyond just the clothing that I'm going to talk about tonight. In fact, the scholar of the French army, Rafe Blaufarb, has summed up, I think quite aptly, the targets of Saint-Germain's reforms as, quote, luxury, favoritism, and social privilege. And this gets to the heart of many of the issues that high-ranking officers like himself found with the French army after the 7 Years' War. He was trying to cut the fat of the household troops. He was instilling new tactical disciplines, reforming punishment, restructuring the officer corps. These are some of the best known aspects of his broader efforts to trim waste, to save money, and increase the efficiency of the French army. And I think that we're justifiably right to acknowledge these various details, but one thing that scholars don't often focus attention on is the most visible, which is the actual appearance of the French army at this time period. And I think it's important because the dress, the appearance of the army gets right to the heart of contemporary debates about form versus function, which were particularly heated in France. Uniforms had this incredible power to represent national identity, which was severely damaged by the loss in the 7 Years' War. but they also had a very practical ability to provide comfort and health to soldiers, which was needed to win France's way back into the center of the world. And this all brings us back to the topic at hand, which is the actual reforms of 1776. Now, the Règlement, the title page of which you see here, concerning the clothing and the equipment of the king's troops, was issued on May 31st of 1776, just 7 months after Saint-Germain's appointment to the war ministry. The text of this Règlement fundamentally alters the appearance of the French soldier. It embodies principles that Saint-Germain would later express in his memoirs, that a soldier's clothing must be distinct and different from a civilian, but cannot be just a theater costume. The text of these regulations dedicates fully 22 pages to the clothing, the headgear, the marks of rank, and the equipment of the French infantry alone, that is just the foot soldiers, more than any previous regulation. And it provided a new range of comforts for French soldiers, part of a kind of a school of thought that was sweeping across France and much of Europe at this time about the health and well-being of the common soldier as being critical to the regeneration of the French military in particular, but soldiers more broadly, that they needed to be healthy and well taken care of to perform their jobs better. And the examples were drawn from an incredibly broad array of sources, from Saint-Germain's own experience, as well as the practices of other contemporary militaries. So to get right down to the nitty-gritty of this thing, the soldier's coat that is described in these regulations had dramatically changed from that previously, both actually physically and linguistically. French military coats began the 18th century described as a justaucorps, a word kind of evolved from the 17th century, which by the middle of the 18th century was being phased out in favor of the term habit, or a coat, in a more modern sense. That is implemented for French uniforms in 1767, but in 1776, we see a full-scale change, not even to an habit, but what was described as an habit veste, or in English, maybe the best term is a jacket. So a rather slim garment, short-skirted, reaching only halfway down the thigh. The coat was designed, although it's shown in most contemporary images, kind of open at the breast where it's hooked closed. It was designed to be able to be buttoned down its entire length to keep the soldier's body warm. The turnbacks on the front of the skirts could themselves be let down to overlap the thighs to keep the legs warm. And the pockets, which were underneath a horizontal pocket flap on the side of the body, were actually cut into the outside of the coat, which allowed the soldier in inclement weather, when it was buttoned across his body, to actually put his hands in his pocket and get things that he might need. There was now no longer any distinction in the way that the collar, the cuffs, the lapels, the pocket flaps were organized as there was in the early 18th century, with those old kind of 17th century hang-ups. Those had actually been abolished a little bit earlier than this, but this uniformly reiterates the same pocket flap is going to be used by every regiment of the French army. Distinctions are now made by the contrasting and idiosyncratic colors applied to the cuffs and the lapels, and a contrasting color on the collar. And this would allow you to determine any French regiment along with the marked buttons, again, going back to that reform in 1762. Now, with the new habit veste, there was a different vest worn underneath. For the vast part of the 18th century, as it was going into the century, French soldiers had worn effectively a smaller coat or sleeve jacket underneath their actual regimental coats. This sleeved jacket, or vest as the French called it, was used by French soldiers so they could take off their coats, they could do their foraging, their wood cutting, making their fire, setting their camp, all this fatigue work in a garment that wouldn't soil their overall nice regimental uniforms. That is completely gone in Saint-Germain's regulation, replaced by actually a lightweight linen sleeveless vest, which was closed at the bottom, and you can maybe make this out in the images here, by a wide belt made of twilled worsted cloth, which could actually be wrapped around the abdomen with 2 sets of buttons, so you could alter the tension of it depending on how you were feeling, or maybe to support the body on a march. Again, thinking about how the soldier is going to be altering this in the field. So this is a dramatic change from previous regulations, but I want to reiterate that although it doesn't match the kind of outlandish uniform that we see Sachs describing earlier in the century, it follows on many of the same principles. That is, this concept of layering lighter garments to provide the soldier with less cumbersome clothing that he could layer and adjust at his own will to meet the needs that he was facing in the field. I think the most striking elements of the uniform in question here were the headgear and the new redingote that was issued. Now, the soldier's hat of the 18th century, the felt cocked hat, or what anachronistically we often see described as the tricorn hat, is something that comes under a particularly harsh amount of criticism over the course of the century. The felt being deemed to be something that absorbs moisture, again, that attention to moisture on the body, and retains it. The hats get out of shape and they look awful. This is a constant critique of military theorists and thinkers throughout the latter half of the 18th century. And many suggested caps of various kinds as a solution. And you might have noticed in that earlier slide that I showed you around 1767 and 1774, the French soldiers are wearing this kind of classical helmet, which is called a casque. And this was introduced in the early 1770s as a way to get around the deficiencies of the felt hats of the time period. In reality, though, it was deemed to be too costly, and ultimately it was abolished by Saint-Germain's tenure. And Saint-Germain then has to introduce a new piece of headgear. And he explains in his memoirs later some of the thinking behind this. He wanted a piece of headgear that could be adjusted by the soldier, something that would drive rain away from the soldier's head, that could channel it away from not only his head, but his body. And so the solution in the regulations of 1776 was, wait for it, you're familiar perhaps with the bicorn, the Napoleonic era, or perhaps, again, anachronistically, the tricorn. Enter the quadricorn, or as the French describe it in this regulation, a chapeau à quatre cornes, a four-sided cocked hat, which was designed with a blunt cone-shaped crown to better shed water off the head, and with a series of kind of buttons and cords running through it so that it could be adjusted further to drive water away from the soldier's head. A bizarre, admittedly, response to this, but one that was very much tied to the soldier's ability to get these things away from the body. Unfortunately, the contemporary images don't really do justice to quite how bizarre this piece of headgear was, and it ends up looking, rather like a typical cocked hat, or in this image from Ludwig van Closen's diary, you don't get much sense for it at all, but this is one of the true innovations of this regulation. Beyond that, though, Sachs, as well as other authors from this time period, had repeatedly suggested the advantages of having a kind of a cloak for foot soldiers. And Saint-Germain agreed with the overall spirit of having some kind of warm, protective outer garment, especially because the underclothing, the regimental coat and the vest, were relatively lightweight by comparison with previous French uniforms, or frankly, other contemporary uniforms. And he advocates in his memoirs and introduces in the 1776 regulations a loose overcoat, or what's described as a redingote. This is a corruption of the English riding coat as a kind of large, loose overgarment. And that makes the 1776 regulations perhaps the first military regulations in Europe that allocate an individual overcoat for every soldier. Prior to this, much of military life still is lived along kind of somewhat communal, again, almost medieval lines. Soldiers eat together, they sleep together, they cook together. Their coats become their blankets. And if men need to be kept warm because they're outside, it's because they're on lonely guard duty, and they'll have some kind of sentinel's cloak or watch coat that they'll wear, and they'll just hand that off to the next guy as they rotate through this. For the first time, though, the French soldier was getting his own overcoat to wear. Now, beyond just the fact that it was an overcoat, it had a relatively tall collar, which helped shield the soldier's neck from the elements, and it actually had two rows of buttons along the front of it. One, which could be buttoned very tightly in cold weather to provide nice, cozy warmth, and another row of buttons along the very outer edge of the garment, which on days like we're having today in Washington, D.C., you could button the entire length, which would close the garment in rainy weather, again, keeping moisture away from the body for its entire length, but not closed against the body so that that moisture would drive into the soldier. All of this designed with this keeping in mind of how you keep soldiers dry and healthy. And I say all of this, I go into this minutia about these uniforms to suggest that for a time period in which military dress is often perceived as being guided more by fashion than function, Saint-Germain's reforms address in explicit detail nearly every failing of French soldiers' dress prior to this, especially those that were attacked by critics and theorists. It was a total reimagination of the French army's appearance, which took unprecedented account of the soldiers' own comfort and health. And it incorporated not only these designs coming out of the theoretical literature, like Marshall Sax's suggestions, Saint-Germain's own experiences in the field with many different armies. In fact, he quite literally, in some of his writings, as well as the text of this, describes how some elements are drawn from Central European, kind of German military or Polish practice, coming from the broader world of military Europe of the 18th century. Despite this, and despite how much every detail of this uniform was designed to address criticisms and concerns previously laid on French uniforms, this new reglement was met with ambivalence, if not outright disdain and resistance across the Kingdom of France. Now, we have to rely here on a kind of scattered set of sources, but the material and the visual evidence from the period of about 1776 to 1778 suggests a very limited adoption of these new reforms. Surviving garments, which are very few, I've illustrated one here in the collection of the Musée de l'Armée from the Poitou Regiment, suggest that at the regimental level, they may have adopted the distinctive new details of the uniform. That is to say, the color of the cuffs and the lapels and the contrasting color of the collars that differentiated regiments, but applied that not to this totally new cut of the uniform, but rather to the previous cut of French uniforms, which retain this kind of lengthy style, not the short, kind of curtailed look of Saint-Germain's regulations. Now, I think we can see, and we can also see this, I should say, in kind of portraiture from this time period, the fact that you have this really distinctive contrasting collar to the rest of the facings, the cuffs and the lapels of the uniforms, allows us to identify in portraiture officers wearing versions of the 1776 uniform. But again, in most cases, they seem to have simply adopted the colors, but not the actual cut of this new piece of dress. And I think that, and of course, more research will always bear out some of my claims, but I think that the limited implementation of the entire 1776 reglement implies a tacit or explicit, maybe, approval of regimental authorities, revealing a bit of the power that was still being wielded at the regimental level within the French army, even though regulations like this were trying to impose a much broader will of the king on the army. Again, this goes back to the significance of the early modern period and how we get these older forms of kind of proprietary ownership of regiments competing with the king's claim to be the overall commander of these armies. And even outside of France, the responses are somewhat mixed. I was able to find some evidence in the National Archives in Great Britain that Lord Barrington, the Secretary at War, was actually able to get a sample of this uniform across the English Channel to Great Britain. And he examines it and he talks with the correspondent about the details. They don't like the hat much. Some authors talk about it as being a mark of caprice or saying that it was very whimsical, heavy, and inconvenient. Sounds like it didn't meet at all Saint-Germain's goals. But he does actually like the idea of the coat. In fact, Lord Barrington admits that I like the plan of a jacket and loose coat to put on occasionally. So it's interesting to see that in some form, at least, we know these garments were being made because they're actually crossing national lines and being examined and analyzed by other powers. Impeding, I think, the implementation of Saint-Germain's reforms was not only the internal economy of regiments themselves, where clothing was replaced on a 3-year cycle. By this time period, the French army reclothes a third of a particular regiment every 3 years, which, if you're doing the math in your head, means that you can get periods with men wearing rather old uniforms next to men wearing rather new uniforms. But I think that aside, and remember, this is a period where the French have gone through a massive series of regulations that they're still trying to catch up with, and then bam, they're hit with this new one. But it also goes to, I think, a persistent diffusion of authority at the expense of the king that reforms like these were in fact meant to suppress and were unable to. And this is, again, as I said, common to all early modern armies. Well before 1776, regulations, or rather before the 1776 regulations, regiments had been flouting various prohibitions on details from everything like the bearskin caps of the grenadiers, which we see in a painting from the early 1780s, but which of course were officially by this time prohibited in the French army, to the use of embroidery or silk cloth by officers. A case in point being this artillery uniform that's at the Musée de l'Armée that's entirely made of silk, which is again expressly described in the regulations that officers will not wear uniforms of silk. They will wear uniforms exactly like those of the men, just of finer quality woolens. But the material survival of objects like these and representations like these, as well as at least one regiment under Rochambeau that marches through Philadelphia wearing their bearskin grenadier caps, shows at the regimental level how even the express regulations of the king were not being followed. And so in the wake of all this, Saint-Germain's departure from the war ministry was announced on September 27th of 1777. Now, I don't think that this unpopular uniform regulations can fully account for his fall. The uniform that he introduced couldn't escape the various other reforms that prompted his dismissal, from the reduction of the household troops to the kind of embarrassing and emasculating punishments, the paddling on the rear of soldiers with a saber that was being imposed upon the army. And I think broadly, all of these reforms, critics reacted to somewhat harshly, not because in some cases they weren't justified, but because they departed from French military norms. It's ironic, I think, that many of his reforms have been classed or subsequently described as being German or Prussian, when in reality there's no true German or Prussian influence. This is rather an adjective that is used extensively even in the 18th century, I think, to both actually and metaphorically qualify reforms in this time period more broadly. And Saint-Germain's efforts reflected as much the thinking of other French officers and his own experiences than they did any actual Prussian practice. And it's also interesting to see that one of the primary criticisms leveled against Saint-Germain for these new uniforms was in fact their expense, which was one of the things that Saint-Germain tried expressly to cut back, was the expenditures of the French army. And I think that this was not a matter of design, but rather more of bad timing. The 1776 regulations, as if you've been following along, fell on the heels of 3 previous uniform regulations in less than 10 years. And as regiments are still catching up with earlier regulations, they're thrown another one here. So even if not truly at all Prussian in style or conception, Saint-Germain's reforms were inconsistent, as many saw it, with French character, souring officers and officials against clothing that was in fact designed to be practical and ultimately benefiting to the soldier's health, morale, well-being, and his ability to fight for France. Now, the February 21st, 1779 reglement, which is the next regulation implemented by Saint-Germain's successor, was yet the 4th in a decade and the 6th new uniform regulation since the end of the 7 Years' War, capping really a period of kind of rapid and profound changes to the appearance of French soldiers. And it sought really to return the French soldier to his proper appearance. It abolished almost all of the details of the 1776 uniform, actually expressly returning the French soldier to an, quote, habit à la Françoise, so a French coat, very explicitly claiming the style as French, and a more conventional cocked hat like its predecessors. In fact, in May of 1779, the Mercure de France praised the new regulations for returning the army to, quote, the national clothing, showing how much national identity was tied to these garments. Despite this, I think the 1779 regulations actually represent something of a compromise, because they incorporated many of the beneficial details and features, at least in spirit, inherited from the failed 1776 regulations, and even added new ones. So for instance, the 1779 regulations kind of formally authorized a gilet, or a lightweight worsted undervest that could be worn by soldiers close to the body underneath their overall uniform to help keep them warm. So this concept of layering and warmth and health persisted, but in different ways, and ones that, frankly, I think were less obvious than Saint-Germain's reforms. The 1779 regulations also rationalized regimental distinctions, which as I've said, even under Saint-Germain had been idiosyncratic, that combination of kind of colored collars and lapels. In 1779, the infantry was divided into divisions of 6 regiments. And those divisions, as you see here, were further subdivided into different classes by the color of their buttons, either yellow metal or white metal buttons. And this whole arcane kind of chart here is meant to show how the army, depending on the color of your buttons, if it was yellow metal button, you had a horizontal pocket flap. If you had white metal buttons, you had a vertical pocket flap. And the distinctions, that is the colors, were reduced in number to the ones listed here on the far side, those divisional colorings. And you could tell which regiment was which by the color of the buttons and whether they carried that distinctive color on solid lapels and solid cuffs and white lapels, or solid lapels and white cuffs. I mean, this is the height of pedantry, but it is also, I think, an incredible expression of the kind of rationalization of control of the Enlightenment. It's categorization, it's control. There is no arbitrary distinctions here. It's very clear who is wearing what. And I think that, despite the fact that there continued to be some deviations from these in practice, and in fact, if you look at the kind of princely regiments, the royal regiments, household troops, foreign troops like the Swiss, there are even express distinctions that are spelled out in the regulations. Nevertheless, this regulation in 1779 proves to be very long-lasting in many of its impulses. And the evidence is there, both in visual culture and in the material culture of what uniforms we have. This is in a private collection, is an officer of the Touraine Regiment, and another from the Royal Suédois, the Royal Swedish Regiment that's in the Army Museum in Stockholm, show actually a very close adherence to these regulations in the material world. And the same thing we see in visual representations, is that pedantic system of uniform identification allows us very clearly to identify uniforms in portraiture because of the precision that it provides. And so I think there was, on the whole, a far greater adherence to the 1779 regulations than Saint-Germain's 1776 reforms. Now, these were further refined in 1786, which remained in effect through the early years of the French Revolution. But I think that they ultimately give the French army the material world that ultimately sees it into the French Revolutionary Wars and later the Napoleonic Wars. I'll close with this slide here from our collections up at Fort Ticonderoga, kind of commemorating the end of the American War of Independence, where at the pinnacle of this pillar of victory is a French cockerel, the fleur de lis, and even above Washington and Franklin, Louis XVI as the author of American independence, to suggest that the French ground forces that come to North America during the War of Independence reflect an incredibly different material world than the French forces that had fought Americans during the 7 Years' War. It is a world away from that earlier experience because of the incredible pace of reform in France in the 1760s and 1770s. And going up to the peak, the pinnacle of this reform in 1776, and then gradually sloping down to the kind of qualified reforms of the 1779 regulation, give the French a material vocabulary that, as I've suggested, also sees them into the end of the 18th century and early 19th century. So I don't think it's any small thing to suggest that, in fact, there is almost a material revolution in the conditions of French soldiers well before the French Revolution itself. And the biggest changes in some ways that occur within the French army during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, at least for the end of the 18th century, is not in the overall style of their clothing or even the level of their construction, but the change in color from the French royal white to the Republican blue. The details of how those garments are even made goes back to those compromise regulations of 1779. And I think by examining, again, material culture and visual representations, we can gauge how much the actual text regulations and the intent that they represented actually had an impact on the French army, and shows what a vibrant and I think understudied period of French military history the era before the French Revolution actually is. And it reminds us how, I think, politically, culturally, militarily, and even materially, the world of the Ancien Regime was heavily altered before, during the French Revolution, it was ultimately destroyed. Thank you.
We have any questions in the audience?
The female figure does not appear to be Marianne. Who is it?
No, it appears to be a representation of a native woman, which is often used in imagery from this time period to represent America broadly. I think in the same vein that you get, Britannia or these other kind of classical type figures, the image of a Native American Indian in that guise is the pictorial representation here of America stomping on frankly what here looks like a leopard, but I think is meant to be a British lion.
I have a question that is going to sound like historiography, but is really a question about the importance of different factors in military outcomes. And what it is how central are these debates to the overall discussion about reform in France? You have sort of parallel debates happening in terms of fortifications. I'm forgetting the name of the cavalry officer who sort of angers all the engineers. Obviously, the Gribeval system of artillery is sort of happening at the same time. And it's funny because if you read de Sac's, he talks about all those things. The engineering aspects of war matter, but he also, is very aware that most soldiers die of disease in this period, not of enemy cannon fire. And, perhaps he has sort of a primitive theory of what causes that, but certainly he would say that ventilation and the amount of time that soldiers spend exposed to moisture seems to be a key factor in that, and he wants to reduce it. And I guess I'm just trying to understand how central the uniform debate is to the overall discussion about what needs to be reformed in order to make the French army better, which also helps us understand sort of their theory of war, their theory of what matters. And I guess it's also interesting to think too, we have sort of good histories of the French engineering corps in this period. There has been plenty of ink spilled on the sort of artillery reforms. We retroactively think the cannons are everything, but it seems like the contemporary French thinkers might have thought the uniforms were about as important, and perhaps we should give that a little bit more credit in our analysis. Forgive a somewhat meandering question.
No, I think it's a really important question. And I think, in some way, my response is that this is actually one of the research angles that I'd like to kind of pursue more, which is how much this was in the kind of minds of critics beyond just, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to talk about how the uniforms are garbage and let's reform them, and how they do in the field. In the same way that, there are kind of analyses of, the maneuvers being done at some of the camps in France during the 1770s, to implement new tactics and to use, new weaponry in some cases. I have not been able personally to look at as many of the kind of firsthand manuscript accounts of officers to see how much this comes into play. Relying more on material and visual sources is what a lot of these conclusions are drawn from. And I don't want to suggest that every theoretical author is thinking about military clothing, because of course they're not. There are many who are just thinking about fortifications, who are just thinking about firearms and artillery, who are thinking about naval matters or whatnot. Some, like Sachs, combine them. Others stick to one thing or the other. And it is also interesting, I think, to think about it in the context of the broader period, when there are additionally authors from outside of France talking about the same thing. So English authors are commenting on these reforms and uniforms, and many of them, really kind of lambast the status quo of military dress at this time period. So I think, my short answer in some ways is that I don't entirely know at a broader level, how the king was thinking about this versus a regimental commander versus, company officers in the field. But it's worth looking at, and I don't want to suggest that this is the only thing that they're thinking of. I think it needs to be considered with all of these other things. And in that sense, the work that I've done on this, I hope will contribute to a broader understanding of the reforms that were going through the French army at this time period as one important component of that, but by no means the salient one. Like I've read some things that say, Saint-Germain was fired because nobody liked his uniform. And I think that's too reductionist. And I don't think it's entirely true, but there must be out there a lot more writings from officers on the ground, if not soldiers. Doubt that, given the relatively limited kind of firsthand accounts of private soldiers in the French army. But I'm sure there are more accounts that get into this. But again, the visual and material evidence is out there to show the kind of limited implementation of this, while other reforms get much more broadly applied. I don't know if that meandering answer entirely answers your meandering question, but I do think that this should be seen as one of a series of reforms that was impacting how the French army was seeing itself and changing at this time period.
All right, well, we do have some questions from Zoom. And this first question is going to jump across the channel.
Oh.
One attendee wants to know if there was a parallel evolution of uniform designing going on in Great Britain.
There's certainly a parallel discussion going on. And again, following the same time period, if you look at the dress of the British Army coming out of the 7 Years' War, even though they're the victors, not the vanquished, by the end of the 1760s, there's pretty dramatic changes going on in British military dress as well. There are a lot of authors, though, who are theorizing or describing even further alterations that they would like to see to the dress of the army. And a lot of it kind of follows, again, a similar line of thinking as what's going on in France. A lot of them additionally cite sacks, as well as some kind of contemporary practice that's going on in continental Europe. And there's a British author who I'm going to profoundly paraphrase here, who at the time says, something like, if the light infantry soldier in his short coat, moves better and without wearing a big heavy cap on his or a hat on his head, and can march and maneuver and fight better, why shouldn't everyone dress like that? They fully appreciate all of the deficiencies with the tall grenadier caps and the lengthy uniforms and whatnot. But again, those are ultimately not implemented, maybe beyond kind of specialist packets. That's another talk. But there is a similar discussion going on. And this is why I think it's important to acknowledge, again, material and visual evidence in particular, and also written accounts, though, to show how even if on a visual level, the dress of an army is changing only marginally, doesn't mean that behind the scenes, people are criticizing that, they're coming up with new alternatives. It just means that for whatever reason, those alternatives are not put into action, or maybe only put into action in special occasions. But the fact that they're being discussed at all shows this kind of disjuncture with our perception of this through purely visual culture that we need to take into account, that we need to analyze and think about carefully.
Absolutely, thank you. One gentleman would like you to speak to the 1770s reforms going on in France and their impact on the American lottery contract codes.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for those in the audience who may not be familiar with this, I think he's referring to ultimately a few tens of thousands of uniforms that were purchased by the Continental Congress from French makers during the American War of Independence. And what is interesting about those is that they come at a time just after the 1776 regulation has been implemented in France. To be completely honest, the limited descriptions there are of the clothing that was sent to America, although it was designed to be made to the standards and quality of the French Royal Army and not better, the descriptions that survive are almost too vague to say how explicitly they were cut like the 1776 uniforms. One wonders also, given how unpopular this regulation was, whether French tailors would be wanting to make something like that. What is clear is that the Americans that are commissioning this uniform incorporate into their contracts explicit deviations from French practice and cut. So the French army, as you can see in most of the images that I've showed here, has these kind of half lapels, that are 7 buttons deep. This is customary, frankly, in most of Europe at this time, to have these kind of half lapels. The British are actually kind of an outlier, as they are in many things, in lapels that go all the way down to the waist. So rather than stopping, say, right here, they would go all the way down to where the pocket flap starts. And the Americans, being that they're largely kind of an Anglo people, actually put into these regulations from France, make them like the French ones, but make sure they go all the way down to the bottom so we can button them fully over in the winter. And they ask for turned down collars, like the British wear at the same time period, which was something that the French had actually moved past by 1775 when they implement a standing collar to the uniforms, which is itself a pretty advanced feature. Of course, these standing collars, if you're familiar with any portrait of George Washington from the late 1780s, 1790s, become really popular at the end of the 18th century. The French are doing this in the mid 1770s. So there were probably elements of that uniform that impacted what was being made for the Continental Army, but I can't say necessarily how much, any of these specific details of French construction, like the passepois, or what in English would be described as the piped edges, were ever applied to the contract clothing that was made for the United States. I will say, though, and it's maybe germane to the question, that some of the broader kind of, again, these theoretical conversations that are happening behind the scenes are also happening in the Continental Army about how to keep soldiers healthy and warm. And especially it's exacerbated in the experience of the Continental Army by the fact that they have a terrible economy and they don't have enough materials and they can't support, kind of broad uniform regulations. But the Marquis de Lafayette, George Washington, and others are describing things that are very similar in their broad kind of sweep to what Sachs and other reformers are describing in Europe. Shorter, lighter weight garments, layering things together. Lafayette even writes about, taking, to deal with the issue of providing the men with stockings, which can be hard to repair. Just having the soldiers grease their feet in tallow and put it into their shoes, which is something that Sachs writes about in his Rêverie that the old veterans in the French army would do to keep their feet, comfortable on the march, to grease their feet up with tallow and stick it in their shoes and then put on their gaiters over that. So eliminating the need for stockings. In the American army, it may have been as much an economic thing as it was a kind of theoretical, like, oh, how can we make the French army better? But nevertheless, they're thinking about it. I don't have any idea that they did that. I see stockings issued throughout the Revolutionary War, but I think it goes to show how much some of these conversations were filtering across the Atlantic Ocean, both through English language and French language kind of publications and individuals.
Thank you. Another attendee wrote, white seems to have been the favored uniform color of the French. Was it not impractical in terms of cleanliness and appearance? Fatigue duty in muddy conditions must have been especially challenging.
Oh, that's a great question. And it would seem to be impractical looking back on this world. And yet I will argue that it's probably the most practical in this time period, because remember that in the 18th century, as it is today, it's a lot easier to get whites whiter than it is to get blues bluer, reds redder, greens greener. Whites can be bleached. There are various ways to treat white to make it look better. And the easiest of those is to scour something, to put it out in the sun. The sun will bleach garments back to white. Now they do, of course, take on a kind of dingier tone over time, I imagine. But you'd be surprised how I think even a dingy white object out in the open sunlight still reads as very white. Whereas that red will fade and deteriorate. Things like greens, especially green, is really fugitive dye in the 18th century because you have to overlay colors. And that fades out and looks awkward. And so I think that white, has benefits of being able to be easily cleaned. You do have to maintain it. And actually French regulations from the time period make express use of to tell soldiers to stop using basically kind of dry cleaning applications, rubbing bran or chalk whiting into the cloth to give it a kind of a whiter appearance, because they feel that ultimately that will be detrimental to the materials. But you can read contemporary descriptions for the English cavalry, for instance, in the 1770s, you have white stable jackets, and there are instructions for how to create a liquid bath filled with whitening that you then apply to the garment. It dries, you kind of beat it out and rub it in, and it looks kind of sparkling white and new again, something you could never do with a red uniform. So in that sense, white is quite practical. It also has the benefit of being, it may be bleached, but in its undyed state, rather cheaper than getting dyed materials done, and you don't have to deal with the potential of different batches or whatnot, maybe. So white in a lot of cases, kind of, if we think about it in a different way, is actually a more practical color, even in this time period. And it's the same reason that for quite some time, well into the 19th and 20th centuries, your undergarments, undershirts, underwear, petticoats, shifts, they're white. Because you can boil it, you can scour it, you can get them back to white again. When you go to a hotel, those white sheets are there because they can be easily turned white again. Something you can't do as well with colors.
Very interesting. How did the manifestations of the regulations of 1779 actually reflect themselves in the documented material culture of the French regiments that ended up in North America, especially in regards to the modifications made for the soldiers intended for tropical service?
So there is, I will say, for the latter part of that question of soldiers going to tropical climates like the West Indies, I have not been able to delve into archival sources as much for that, which I believe are out there. The uniform that I showed earlier, that all silk uniform in express, deviation from the regulations, there's been speculation that that may have been made for a tropical climate, an officer maybe in the West Indies or the East Indies. There's certainly comparable examples of Anglo-American uniforms made of silk for hot climates. There's some uniforms from South Carolina officers from the Revolutionary period and just afterwards made of silk. There are identifiably silk coats being worn by British officers, both in Gibraltar and India, that turn up in portraiture. You can spot them because they usually look pink, because the way the dyes take to the silk, evidently, or the way at least silk is represented in art. So the French may have been doing that in that regard. Concessions for hot climates in many cases in the kind of European Atlantic world are not necessarily done through the outer garments, but undergarments that you would wear, lighter weight clothing underneath. So for instance, the French raised in the early 1770s a series of colonial regiments for Saint-Germain, for Guadeloupe, for Martinique, 4 regiments in total. Their uniform coats are wool, but they're described as light wool. Now, how light that is, I don't know, because I haven't seen a swatch of it. I don't know if one survives. But their underclothing, their vests and their breeches are specifically to be made of ticking, of hard wearing, but a linen cloth, which is no doubt a concession to the climate of the West Indies. And so when we hear, descriptions of kind of tropical clothing, it may simply be the undergarments. Maybe for outer garments as well, but I can't say as much about that because I just haven't looked into those sources. But the explicitly raised units going to the West Indies often have those distinctions. And furthermore, even in the 1779 regulations and other regulations, the French typically allow, if the regimental accounting allows for it, for soldiers to have an additional pair of breeches specifically for the summer. Knowing that it's hotter in summer, and if you give people lighter weight clothing, they'll be in better health. The problem with any lightweight linen garments, though, is that linen wears out a lot quicker than wool. And the French army, those overgarments, their coats are supposed to last them for 3 years because it also acts as your blanket in camp. So they're substantially made. That's one of the details that actually getting to look at French uniforms in the 18th century really struck me, coming from the kind of Anglo-American experience, is that they are much more heavily built and finished than comparable, say, English or Brunswick or Prussian uniforms, which were typically only meant to last for a year. And they're going to. The linen stuff is not going to last as long. Now, of the troops serving in America, from the returns of the regiment serving in America, there's very little that tells me kind of beyond, generally that they had the equipment, what they're wearing. I think what limited evidence there is out there suggests that they were following the 1779 regulations pretty clearly. There's some visual imagery of officers serving in America where they're clearly wearing that uniform. There's a kind of famous pension application from a continental soldier who witnesses the French army, and he describes the colors of each regiment's distinctions. And he's spot on with every regiment. They're all wearing the 1779 colors, except for one, the Saint-Ange regiment, which he describes in this other odd color. He says, I think he says it's orange or something, which actually matches the 1776 regulation uniforms. So he may have seen a part of that regiment that had not yet fully cycled into its new uniform, but while they were in America, I believe, got those new garments. But beyond that, any concession to the climate here in North America, the only direct evidence we have is the Soissonnais regiment, whose colonel, according to one of the French officers' accounts, was the only one of the French regiments who had purchased his men linen breeches for their march. And he credits their general health better than the rest of Rochambeau's army on the way south to the fact that they have these lightweight summer breeches as they're marching towards Virginia. Beyond that, it's hard to say. We do know that there are accounts of some of the troops coming up with Saint-Simon's Corps from the West Indies at Yorktown, which, frankly, Virginia isn't that cold in the grand scheme of things. But, shivering at night and being extremely cold because they came up from the West Indies wearing these tropical garments. What exactly that means, I think it even says explicitly linen, Are they wearing linen coats? I don't know, but probably, linen undergarments at the very least.
Interesting. And you just tackled the next question. So
Oh.
thank you. So two birds with one stone there. I think that's a great place to wrap up. So I want to thank you again for a fascinating presentation. You're getting positive reviews on Zoom, and
Excellent.
I'm sure the feeling is mutual for those here in attendance. So I want to thank everybody who tuned in virtually and who braved the weather here in Washington to be with us in person. So again, thank you very much for a great presentation and everybody's support, continued support of our mission. So we will see you very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.